Good afternoon. We are excited to be presenting this panel on climate migration and displaced people. This panel is sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. We are actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. I'm your moderator, Nikiba Brown. I hold a global LLM in global environmental law from Pace University's Haub School of Law. Today, we're talking about climate change and climate change migration and displaced people. Climate change is exacerbating migration all over the world. Today's event focuses on migration and displacement. And so to contextualize it, let me give those of you who don't have a background a little bit of a definition. Climate migration is a term that we use to refer to those people who are forced to flee due to sudden or gradual alterations in the natural environment related to at least one of three impacts of climate change. It could be sea level rise, extreme weather events, or drought and water scarcity. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, nearly 1,900 disasters triggered 24.9 million new displacements across 140 countries and territories in 2019 alone. This is the highest figure recorded since 2012, and it's 3 times the number of displacements caused by conflicts and violence. This is going to continue to occur, not only because of sea level rise, but because of the effects left in the wake of extreme weather events such as tsunamis, monsoons, hurricanes, and droughts, and it leaves land to subsequently be unlivable. Climate migration and the rise of climate refugees globally also brings about indirect issues that threaten our most vulnerable citizens. For example, 48% of the migrants worldwide are women and girls. We cannot avoid the fact that they are going to also be prone to exploitation, abuses, and trafficking. Protection of their fundamental rights will become even more relevant as displacement becomes more prevalent. The consequences of climate change and migration present humanity with an unprecedented challenge. The goal of our program today is to highlight, explain, and to foster a discussion about the magnitude of this crisis and to identify ways in which the law and us as attorneys, its stewards, can apply an environmental justice filter to the day-to-day practice. We should be able to use this filter as a way to mitigate the effects of our clients' actions to vulnerable individuals. At its worst, the continued displacement is projected to cause upwards of 1 billion people to be forced to migrate in search for higher ground, fertile soil, potable water, and safety for their families. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions to our panelists, however, through the Q&A and not the chat function, which I just misused. If you do not see the controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. We will address questions at the end of the panel. We will be sharing a recording of this program to everyone who has registered so that you could share it widely with your networks. With that, we are thrilled today to bring to you our program entitled Climate Migration and Displaced People. Our panelists today are Amma Francis, Regina Paulos, and Erin Daly. Our first speaker is going to be Amma Francis, who is a climate law fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University. Amma's work focuses on developing legal solutions to disaster displacement and climate migration. She also analyzes and supports the implementation of adaptive measures in small islands and least developed countries. Amma's work at the Sabin Center cuts across issues of international law. Amma is a proud graduate of Yale Law School from 2018 and is also a native of Dominica in the Caribbean. Amma, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Nikiba, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to everyone who's joining us virtually today. I'm Amma Francis. I'll jump right in. I'll be talking today about climate-induced migration, and I'm so happy that we're having this conversation. I think climate-induced migration is the human face of the climate challenge, and it's so critical that we're having this conversation. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. So I will be talking today about solutions to climate-induced migration, specifically ways to close the legal protection gap for climate migrants with a focus on small island developing states. To start off the discussion, I wanted to ground us by starting with a video that shows an incident of displacement from my home island, Dominica, that occurred after Hurricane Maria in 2017. Many of you might be familiar with Hurricane Maria. It devastated a number of Caribbean islands, including Puerto Rico. And in Dominica, it damaged and destroyed 90% of houses, causing 20% of the population to flee. This is the largest incidence of displacement per capita worldwide that's occurred to date. So I just want to start us off with this video just to give us a sense of what climate migration can look like.
It sits at 15 degrees north, 61 degrees west. It was christened White Tickabully by the native Indian population, which means tall is her body. It was the last island in the Caribbean to be colonized. Its 73,000 residents are spread over the 290 square miles of mostly mountainous, green, lush, rugged terrain, and are kept hydrated by an unprecedented 365 rivers and 8 breathtaking waterfalls. It's Wednesday, September 20th, 2017. As dawn breaks, a satellite reveals the colossity of a slow-moving monster carrying a payload of heavy rainfall and winds in excess of 175 miles per hour. In her wake, the sun rises over the sea and the Commonwealth of Dominica lays shattered. Its people overwhelmed and the devastation likened to a country ravaged by war. Hundreds of Dominicans packed the port almost on a daily basis, trying to flee the mud, malaise, and miserable post-apocalyptic living conditions left by Maria.
So I use this video not just to give us a sense of what climate migration can look like, but also to highlight the basic mechanism by which climate results in displacement. And so climate change increases the frequency and severity of disasters like hurricanes, floods, and droughts, and then disasters displace millions of people annually, as Naikiba said. In the past 2 years, disasters have been the lead cause of displacement more than armed conflict and violence. So this is a huge problem. And while most climate migrants move within their own countries, many are also forced to leave home or forced to cross national borders, as we just saw with this video. And this is a problem because international law guarantees almost no protection to climate migrants when they're displaced across national borders. There's no governing multilateral framework that covers climate-induced migration, and climate migrants have no right of entry into other states, have no right of resettling, working, or even being protected against forcible return, like others who are fleeing dangerous situations. Another reason that there's this legal protection gap is because international refugee law doesn't cover climate migrants. As many of you know, I'm sure, the cornerstone of international refugee law is the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. But the Refugee Convention doesn't actually cover climate migrants. There's a particular definition of refugees under international law, those with a well-founded fear of persecution because of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular group. And this definition doesn't include climate migrants. There were more than 20 cases argued in New Zealand and Australia over the past years, and where petitioners claimed that they should be afforded refugee protection because they were fleeing climate-related events. And none of these cases have succeeded. So as of today, no court has extended protection based on refugee law to any climate migrant. Nevertheless, despite this significant legal gap, there have been really important developments in the past decade when it comes to the law and climate-induced migration. Earlier this year, in January 2020, we received a landmark decision from the UN Human Rights Committee on climate-induced migration. So I just want to take a little bit of time to explain this communication. So Tessiota, who is a man from Kiribati, a small island state in the Pacific, had moved to New Zealand for work and overstayed his visa when he was picked up by authorities and was facing deportation. He appealed to New Zealand's immigration tribunals, claiming that he should be afforded refugee status because if returned to Kiribati, he would face serious harm because of sea level rise, land scarcity, and environmental degradation. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court of New Zealand, but Tessiota ultimately did not succeed and he was deported, and the Supreme Court of New Zealand acknowledged that climate change has serious impacts and would cause Kiribati to experience significant challenge, but that Mr. Tessiota himself, if returned, would not actually face serious harm. And also that, moreover, that the government of Kiribati was actually taking steps to protect its citizens from the effects of climate change, which also counted against Tessiota's refugee claim. Tessiota was deported, but then he filed a communication with the UN Human Rights Committee asserting that New Zealand had violated his right to life under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. His basic claim was that, again, land scarcity, lack of safe drinking water, violence over agricultural produce and land was threatening his right to life. And in the most robust language we've seen on this to date, the UN Human Rights Committee decided that without robust national and international action, climate change will likely undermine people's right to life. And in that case, receiving countries of climate migrants will have an obligation not to send people back to life-threatening situations. Now, what does this mean? This means if a climate migrant is fleeing a climate-related event and a receiving country receives that climate migrant, they'll actually have an obligation not to send that person back to their home country if that person is facing life-threatening situations. This is the most significant language we've gotten on climate-induced migration to date in terms of filling the legal protection gap. In the last decade, there have also been a number of important developments in the international policy landscape and legal landscape. In 2010, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change recognized human mobility. That's another way of describing migration for the first time. In 2015, the landmark Paris Agreement, which I'm sure many of you heard about, set up a task force to avert, minimize, and address climate migration. And finally, in 2018, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration recognized and established that climate change is a driver. It's something that causes people to move. And the Global Compact was the first internationally negotiated agreement on migration. And so the fact that it recognized climate change as a reason people move was really critical. Another reason the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration is worth highlighting is because it outlines specific steps that national governments can take to make sure that they are closing the protection gap for climate migrants. For example, if there is a sudden onset disaster, that just means something that happens rapidly, like a hurricane or a flood, countries can develop mechanisms like humanitarian visas or temporary work permits to allow people to move to shelter and safety. Governments might even consider planned relocation, so actually planning for people to move in a way that protects their rights and dignity. So I highlight this because to show that there are concrete ways that we can close the legal protection gap for climate migrants, and also that the onus is on national governments to do this work. And I want to spend some time just highlighting one solution that I'm really excited about called free movement agreements. Free movement agreements are regional trade agreements that liberalize the movement of people between member states. The European Union is the most well-known example, but more than 60% of nation states around the world participate in some sort of free movement agreement. These agreements can be very simple. They can remove visa requirements for intra-regional travel. So you have a set of countries that decides that citizens of those countries don't need visas for entry, to more complex agreements that allow citizens of participating states to transfer social security benefits and rights, work without having to get a work visa or a permit, or even resettle and apply for residence in other states permanently. Again, most of these are linked to a trade agreement, and the basic idea is that as we allow for increased mobilization of goods, we should also let people and labor move freely. And in the environmental context, free movement agreements have allowed people who are displaced by disaster to resettle in nearby countries in the past. In the Caribbean, I started off with this video of Dominica being impacted by Hurricane Maria. Many of the people who left Dominica, 20% of the population, as I mentioned, made use of free movement agreements in the Caribbean to resettle in other islands. There are two free movement agreements in the Caribbean, CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, both which have trade unions that allow people to move either for 6 months in the case of CARICOM or indefinitely in the Eastern Caribbean. And both of these free movement agreements allowed people to access 4 really critical rights or benefits, let's say. The first is that these free movement agreements allowed people who are displaced by disaster the right to move to another island. So in the case of Dominica, where 90% of buildings were destroyed, including homes, people had a means of entering another island really quickly to seek shelter and safety. In some cases, these agreements allowed people to move with other sorts of travel identification documents like driver's licenses instead of passports, especially where documents had been lost or damaged. And also during this especially devastating hurricane season, these free movement agreements allowed some people to resettle permanently in other islands and access labor markets by having agreements that allow people to apply for work in other islands and in some cases not even need a work permit. I highlight these agreements as a way of saying that we have mechanisms in law already for facilitating movement of people. And the more that we plan and enhance these pathways for movement, the more that migration can be an opportunity and a real way that people can adapt to changing climate. I want to just end by bringing us to the US context because I know sometimes when we think of climate-induced migration, especially when we encounter it in the news, it can seem like there'll be an influx of foreigners coming into the US. And there are a couple of things I want to say about this. The first is that, as I mentioned, the majority of climate migration actually happens within national borders. So most people are moving within their own countries. In the US, for example, there will be 13 million residents within, coastal residents within this century who will be forced from states like Florida or Louisiana to other inland states in Texas, like Texas, for example, or Georgia. But there will also be people coming to the US from other places. Recently, the New York Times reported that there will be 30 million climate migrants coming from just Central America and Mexico within the next 30 years. And in terms of planning, US policy can either trap climate migrants, both those coming from within the US and those coming from outside of the US so that people have limited choices in moving, or the US can use this movement of people to capture benefits for the receiving communities that are taking them in and for the migrants themselves. But again, it's critical that we plan. So I want to end by highlighting the climate action plan that came out of the US House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And I encourage you all to check out this climate action plan. It's the one that we have right now. And the climate action plan very helpfully underlines that climate-induced migration is a challenge that we are facing. It's already happening, and one that will increase in the future without significant efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. But it unhelpfully frames climate-induced migration as a national security threat. And so this is a problem because it limits the scope of the recommendations in response to this challenge. If we frame climate-induced migration as just a national security threat, then the idea is to manage the threat by blocking entry as much as we can. And so the US House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis recommends that the Department of Homeland Security investigate and report on the implications of climate change on national security, including by preparing the homeland for internal and cross-border migration driven by climate change. It also recommends that the US provide humanitarian aid to help people stay in place. But I would argue actually that an equity-centered climate action plan, as this climate plan claims to be, actually needs to be providing mechanisms for people to move more easily. And not only as a matter of equity, but also as a matter of economics. We know many countries are taking the view that immigration is an essential part to their long-term economic prosperity. And I think by facilitating ways for people to move legally, we actually enhance the opportunity for climate migration to be a transformative event rather than one of absolute despair. So I'll just end with three main points. The first is that if we care about climate-induced migration, and I hope we all do, the most effective thing we can do is to cut greenhouse gas emissions. The most effective thing that we can do is cut our emissions, cut down on carbon pollution. We do this, we'll 80% fewer climate migrants. The second is that migration is a really natural phenomenon. Humans have been doing it for centuries, as long as humans have existed. The problem is not migrants, it's the law. And so planning for migration allows us to transform this very natural thing into something that benefits migrants and receiving communities rather than this occasion for despair and conflict. And finally, there are actual concrete ways to close the legal protection gap surrounding climate-induced migration, special visas, free movement agreements, which I talked about, temporary work schemes, and a number of others. So I'm looking forward to talking more in the Q&A. Thank you all. And I'm looking forward to being in discussion.
Amma, thank you so much for that. You brought up so many points and contextualized so many issues. I have a couple of questions for you as follow-up that I am very intrigued because I do think that you bring about a very solution-oriented approach. So I want to address the issue of sovereignty. And so for those of you not familiar with international law, sovereignty is one of the biggest issues in climate migration because sovereignty is basically the principle of international law that states that every country should maintain the power to exercise power, essentially. And that exercising of power can say, well, I want to close my borders and I do not want to let people in. And I am comporting with this principle of international law by saying so, and I'm not violating any issues. How do you reconcile for that?
Yeah, that's a really astute question, and thank you for that. So yeah, as you're saying, sovereignty, I would claim that sovereignty in its contemporary sense is actually constituted through this very right to exclude foreigners. So countries claim and measure their sovereignty by their ability to exclude people from entering their countries. And this is a problem not only because many people, more people than ever in history are moving based on conflict, based on disasters than ever before, but also it's just wrong. Sovereignty doesn't actually need to be constituted through exclusion. There are many countries, for example, by participating in free movement agreements that show that you can have a more liberal stance towards admitting foreigners and still maintain your sovereignty as a country. The other way I think that climate change intersects with sovereignty, which I didn't talk so much about, is through this question of habitable territory. So small island states, because of climate change, will become uninhabitable. Unfortunately, that's looking like the future we have. And the question then becomes, if a country becomes uninhabitable, does it still remain a sovereign state? In international law right now, there's a presumption that countries will continue to be countries, even if they no longer can support human life. But then that raises all sorts of other questions, governance questions. Well, how do you govern a dispersed population? How does a government provide benefits to people that are not all in one place? These are the challenges that we're going to have to use our legal imagining, creativity to try to solve in a way that hopefully is protecting people who are put in this vulnerable situation because of the ways that we consume and live our lives.
Thank you so much. And my final question for you is, you just mentioned the economic benefit, and I think that's a really good point. I know that at the UN, in the high-level dialogues that are being had about displacement and climate change, several member states have highlighted how migration has actually had great economic impact. So can you please speak more to the economic impacts that you think are beneficial to these nations if they do actually open their borders to climate migrants? And just in general, not only economic benefits, but I would love for you to expound on the other benefits that you see.
Yeah, there are quite a range. There was a think tank in Canada that recently identified that because of Canada's aging population, Canada is fairly sparsely populated and also has a very aging population. Because of this, they'll actually need immigration to secure long-term economic prosperity. And for other industrialized countries, this is also true. Just climate migrants and all sorts of migrants come in and do important jobs. They open businesses. And in the short term, this can lead to some tension. But in the long term, they really can support receiving communities. And so in the Caribbean, for example, allowing people to move around helps fill labor gaps. For example, if there are labor shortages, migrants can help fill those. But the critical thing is for this to be planned. And so that's why I call on us and governments to think about planning for this movement in advance and highlight ways to do that. I'll just end with this. It also benefits sending countries. When you have migrants go out and come back, they come back with skills. They might come with new cultural ideas. This exchange, I think, especially in this globalized world, can really be a good thing. We have to just make sure people are protected when they're moving.
Thank you so much, Amma. That was so enriching and informative. And I think we all can see an optimistic way forward with the frameworks and with the legal work that's actually being put in place. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is actually Regina Paulos, an international criminal lawyer, and she obtained her JD from Seattle University School of Law and her LLM in International Crime and Justice from the University of Torino, UNI-CRI. She presents and publishes on topics related to international criminal law, transnational crimes, and responses to mass atrocities. She has participated on 2 different People's Tribunals and is the editor of the 2019 volume of the People's Tribunal, Human Rights and the Law, Searching for Justice. She currently serves as the chair of the World Peace Through Law section of the Washington State Bar Association and is co-chair of the International Refugee Law Committee of the American Bar Association. Everyone, please help me welcome Regina Paulos.
Thank you, Nakiba. So I'm gonna jump right in it, but I wanna thank Scott and Dan Appelman for having me on this panel, which it's gonna be tough to follow Amma's lead, but I'm gonna try. So with that being said, Nakiba's introduction was a very good one because she's painted a great picture of what is going on already in the status quo and the challenges that people are facing as a result of climate change. And I think my contribution to this conversation is going to be something a little bit different in that we have actually seen, and there are multiple examples of this going on constantly, where climate change is being used as a card by governments to actually perpetuate human rights violations or actually create a whole human rights norms that are being violated specifically towards indigenous groups. And so I want to focus today on something that may not, a lot of people may not know about and may not seem very, kind of normal to the ears, I guess, when we're thinking about climate change, because we tend to think about climate change as having all these great responses: wind power, hydropower, solar energy. And we think that all of these things are great, but there's actually a different coin, a different side to it that needs to be examined. So I'm going to take a look at two different types of projects, and there are multiple types out there. But the first one I want to focus on is what I called conservation or wildlife projects. And these are projects that generally are pushed for by many non-governmental organizations, and saying that we need to do something in order to protect a certain species, wildlife species, from extinction, which I think are very good reasons to do that. And there's a great reason for us to do it. We need our wildlife, and they are very critical, many of them. So the example I want to use is one that's happening in India, and that is that the Indian government has actually done a really great job in trying to protect the tiger. The wild tiger population, the largest in the world, is in India. They have, over the last couple of decades, increased that population, and they've tried their best to do that, given the environmental history that happened during colonial times, where the tiger was decimated due to their colonial masters, so to speak. And so as a result of that, India has responded to that. And of course, the tiger faces a lot of threats, one of them, of course, being climate change, which impacts their habitats, and the large issue, which is poaching, that also happens. But what India did eventually was create laws that allowed wildlife officials to be able to go into different areas and designate areas as tiger habitats. And what they ended up doing, the impact of that, is that there were people who became forcibly displaced from that, and they were evicted out of the forest. And these were, they're known as Adivasis in India, but really the word that most of us may know as tribal peoples. And so in 2011, there was one success story of a group called the Saliga people, who actually sued because they were evicted from their forests, in which they have ancient traditions and rights to, and had been there. They actually worship the tiger as a deity, and they were able to successfully sue. The court actually told them that they could have stay in the forest, and they were able to be there. And as a result of that, they're back in there. And what the research, and I know the research is ongoing, but what it's shown is that the tiger population, as a result of the Saliga being there, has increased because they have extra guardians in the forest. Now, this example, there are multiple like this around the world. Unfortunately, not all of them are good stories like this, but where NGOs have gone into governments and asked them to protect wildlife, but at the cost of displacing people. So if we already have this ongoing situation where the land may not be habitable because of climate change, and then we have all these external factors going on, and then in addition to this, we have, in the name of climate change, more things being done to push people out of where they know their environments more than anyone else, then we have these kinds of issues. So I think this is one example that's worth looking at and reframing, because it's really important that we have Indigenous voices in it, and we have people who are Indigenous people who actually have the knowledge to be able to protect their lands and to protect the wildlife. Another type of green project, and this is kind of the second category that I consider, is what I call green energy projects. And these are things like wind power farms, hydropower, meaning dams. And I, to be honest, have not really looked in to see whether solar power has caused this kind of displacement, because there's so much just alone with hydropower. And these conversations each probably should take up their own webinars for 2 hours, because there's so many different facets to them. But just to be brief so that we can get to the discussion, because I think that'll be important, is that, so for instance, in terms of wind power, right now in Norway, I think there's a really great, a great example of how Norway is committed to having clean energy, and in the name of climate change has committed to creating more wind power farms. And so they have a project right now called Storia, and forgive me because I'm not Nordic, so I know I'm probably not saying that right. But this project would actually be placed on, the wind turbines would actually be placed on land that the Sami people, who are an ancient Nordic group of people, tribal people, use to allow their reindeer to herd and to graze on. And these wind power projects are really detrimental to that. So if you know anything about the Sami people, the reindeer herding and their livelihood and all that is really interconnected culturally, and they don't have a very good history with the governments in the Nordic region. They've been victims of forced sterilization, repression of their culture, language, all types of identity erasure that have gone on, which we would probably refer to as cultural genocide, but there isn't really a crime like that that's recognized formally under the Genocide Convention, so to speak. But with that being said, this wind power is just one more project that they would have to deal with culturally in having to maintain something that they've done for quite some time in their livelihood. It's not something that they just picked up yesterday and started doing. So the government of Norway claims that they've done the environmental impact assessment, and despite that, they have found that even though this may hurt the reindeer herders, that they're going to continue with the project and just provide compensation and try to mitigate the damages as much as possible. The problem is that the reindeer, the impact of these wind turbines in terms of the noise, the visual effects of seeing these turbines also impact the reindeer, not only in terms of how they may move, but also in terms of breeding. So this is one example of where we have something like wind power, which is really great. And I'm sure there are a lot of lawyers on this call that or Zoom meeting that probably work on projects like this and think, well, yes, that's really great. It meets sustainable development goals. It's clean. There really should be no bad impact to it. Maybe some birds die, but overall, it's a great thing. But the reality is there's another side to this that we need to really consider and we need to look at. The other example is hydropower. And this, again, is one that I'm very interested in it, more so because there's so many grassroots movements around anti-dam building and things like that. And these grassroots movements by tribal groups and indigenous groups all over the world really have had a tremendous impact in actually stopping some projects. And sometimes the projects continue, they just may stop for a little while. And so with hydropower, what we're talking about is dams. And so for those of us who live in America, or if you've visited America, I'm talking about something like the Hoover Dam, which that may be actually maybe a mid-sized to smaller one compared to a lot of other dams around the world. And so with hydropower, yes, it's a clean source of energy. It is renewable. It's using water in order to create the energy source. But what happens is as it goes through phases, we have governments that say they're doing environmental impact assessments, but people are not really being asked properly what exactly is going to happen to them. The environmental impact assessments aren't really being done in a scientific or appropriate manner as to find out what the real impact is going to be in these areas when these dams are being built along these rivers or in these rivers. And then we have during the building and the phases into the final phases, we are seeing that either the construction is really bad because you don't have the right people building the dams. You have people who are being forced to migrate and are displaced because of the construction, and where the government says that they would compensate people or relocate them, that's not even happening. And there's no way for them to really go after the governments for that. And so there is a total component or a lack of really justice or access to justice in that regard. And then we also have at the end of it, when the dams are being built, that a lot of these projects, which cost millions of dollars, the governments can't afford to upkeep them. So after maybe 50 to 60 years, these dams are in real bad shape. And you have things like we've seen in 2018, for instance, the Laotian Dam in the middle of construction actually collapsed, and it hurt not only thousands of people on the Laotian side who were homeless and died as a result, but on the Cambodian side, we had a close upwards of 25,000 people that had to be evacuated with no early warning system in place to warn people that something bad was happening. The same type of thing, a little bit of a different scenario, happened in Kerala in 2018 with the Kerala floods, where we saw an unprecedented rain season with the monsoons. And while that was going on, the dams, which actually help the Tamil Nadu side, which is the state that's next, that borders Kerala, the dams are in Kerala, but are assist with Tamil Nadu. They released the dam water because it had overflown so much because of the rain that as that came up, it actually ended up becoming a catastrophe. People were really in bad shape because of the flooding. And the governments go back and forth and always say, well, we had nothing to do with it, and they shirk responsibility. But the fact of the matter is they're not compensating people for the things that when they happen. And there's a lot of just back and forth with it. and a lot of irresponsibility that's going on with it. So the takeaways here, and I'm gonna kind of wrap this up so I can be on the hot seat for a little bit with Nakiba, but also that we can hear from Aaron, is that first and foremost, I would encourage the American Bar Association, where possible, as we continue these climate conversations and with all the other committees around, that Indigenous people, tribal people, that they be involved in these conversations. I think that we are missing a huge gap of knowledge because we're not including them in all these conversations. And we tend to think of them as people who are not modernizing, or they're not appropriately acclimating to us, when in fact they have the best probably mechanisms of being able to adapt after centuries and ancient traditions that they've been able to keep. And we know that changes have happened before. It's just that this type of change now is induced by us, as most scientists say. And so so that's the first thing, is that I think the ABA needs to make sure that it is inclusive of Indigenous voices at every turn. The second thing is that, speaking from my specific area of expertise, I think that the International Criminal Law Framework, given some of the examples, I think it's void of environmental crimes, and it needs to be included. And I think that a lot of these situations like forced displacement could rise to the level of the higher of kind of the bigger international crimes. Not that I think there's a hierarchy between crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. There are really, a victim is a victim of a crime. But the fact of the matter is that the environmental crimes shouldn't be ignored. And then finally, and hopefully this dovetails nicely into what Aaron will talk about, but I think one of the bigger pressing questions we have to answer is, when we talk about climate change, what are we really talking about? What is it that we're really after? If we're looking for just fast solutions, we're more likely than not going to be ignoring a huge segment of the population that has the best solutions to this. Or are we looking for really just smart solutions? And what kind of solutions does that look like? Because building projects in the name of saying that we're responding to climate change or the UN development goals really isn't going to help us if it means that we're going to, on the other hand, destroy the human rights regime that we work so hard to uphold. So with that, Nakiba, I'll turn it back over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Regina. You brought about so much light to how bad things can get if we move quickly and not intentionally. Your takeaways are so important. And so the first one I'm going to look at is what you just said. When we look at climate change, are we actually talking about equitable distribution of the resources that will help us to battle climate change? And when I did my introduction, I introduced the topic, which actually came from an organizer of this, Scott Badenoch. It's the idea that lawyers should always apply an environmental justice filter. And so if you're practicing corporate, if you're practicing real estate, I think there should absolutely be a filter where you look at the humanity and the actual ramifications long-term of what you are advocating for on behalf of your clients. And just take that into account. It's taking into the humanity of everything. Another thing I really wanted to press into what you mentioned was the international legal framework needing to include environmental laws. I completely agree with that, and I think many others do, because I mean it's very difficult to really compartmentalize everything into those three categories in which the framework does. And the biggest thing, which I have so much to say about, is when you spoke about hydro energy. So this is completely my opinion right now. Hydro energy, I don't think, is a renewable source, because the thing is that fresh water is finite. So when we talk about hydroelectric plants being built up, I'm completely personally against them. I'm not speaking on behalf of the ABA here, but I can see, I mean, it's to me, no pun intended, the most damning form of clean energy, because it has so many far-reaching effects. The first I'm thinking about is the water laws, right? And the rights to the water. From a domestic standpoint, I think of the battle between Florida and Georgia and the Chattahoochee right now, where there's the water consistency in Florida is changing because Atlanta, everyone is moving there, everyone wants cheap houses. And so there's far more consumption of that river, and it's adversely affecting fishing farmers in South Florida and on the Gulf Coast. I also think about on an international level, Ethiopia and Egypt, and how damming our river, damming the Nile in Egypt is going to completely cut off Ethiopia. And I think of that area of like East Africa, and it's not necessarily, it's not as water rich as other areas. In fact, Eritrea is completely, which is right above Ethiopia, is actually completely arid and semi-desert climate, I guess it would be. So that's very, very interesting that you brought up. I want to definitely, I kind of took that over from you, Regina.
No, you're fine.
But I just really wanted to highlight those things. I want to also know, so when you say that Indigenous people should be included in the conversation, what does that look like for you?
Well, I think what it looks like for me is that when we are talking about projects, and there are plenty in the United States, I just didn't use those examples because we're in a political election cycle where everything changes every 5 minutes right now. So the examples that I've given are ones that we can, I know right now where the outcome is heading. But so for instance, these environmental impact assessments that are done in Asia, you know, a lot of the Adivasi groups, or even the ones that are in China and other places, they're not at the table. The government
Right.
is just rubber stamping these applications. And I think we need to figure out in the framework where the UN has, under the UN Declaration on Rights of the Indigenous People, free, prior, and informed consent, that has to be integrated at every single turn in order to make sure that there is genuine participation, that it is free, prior, and informed, and that these people, that when they talk about their lands, that there is a distinction made between the fact that we're not just talking about someplace, you know, where like you and I may just rent an apartment. We don't have necessarily a connection to that, right? Whereas they have ancient traditions, cultures that may be totally connected to the areas that they're in. And I think that if there's one thing that I can pinpoint to, is the fact that the free, prior, and informed consent doctrine time and time again is being ignored. So if we can at least start with that, that would be really great. In addition to the fact that these kinds of dialogues, I think we need to see, and we need to be more inclusive of their voice, because they know best. I really believe that.
Absolutely. And Regina, when we spoke before, you mentioned that you have a project coming up. Are you writing?
Oh, yes, thank you. So there's actually two. At the beginning of October, October 1st and 2nd, for those people who are interested in environmental crimes, we'll be holding a virtual conference that you can attend and listen to a bunch of speakers talk about different forms of environmental crimes taking place. And then the second thing is that we do have a volume coming out with Vernon Press in 2021, early 2021, on international criminal law and environmental crimes, or green crimes as they're being known now as. And in that volume, we'll explore whether or not there really is a space for that, or is it time for just a new environmental crimes regime to be created. So thank you for that, Nagiba.
Absolutely. I really appreciate how we have been able to, or how between you and Amma, we've been able to contextualize the fact that everything green is not necessarily good if we're not thinking about the long-lasting effects, and if we're not really thinking about also the far-reaching immediate effects. Again, just finally honing in on the water thing, I can think of just how you mentioned the unsustainable infrastructure and maintaining the infrastructure of a dam, and what happens to people when dams are broken, the actual environmental effects of when those dams are broken and the runoff, and it is overflowing and it's causing mudslides. That has happened in Brazil over the past, I want to say 3 or 4 years, quite a few times. And again, just honing in on fresh water is not, it is a very, very finite resource that's running out. If you look in the western part of the United States, you can see pretty clearly that fresh water is absolutely a finite resource that we're running out of. So Regina, thank you so much for that. I am going to bring it to our final speaker, who is very much tied in with this, as she's going to talk about human dignity, which Regina began to broach. Our final speaker for this event is actually Erin Daly. She is a professor of law at Delaware Law School and the co-founder of the Dignity Rights Project at Delaware Law School. She serves as the director of the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment. Professor Daly has written extensively on comparative constitutional law and transitional justice issues throughout the world, and teaches in the area of dignity rights, constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, First Amendment, administrative law, human rights, and property law. So Erin, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess that's just a testament to how long I've been teaching, that I've been teaching a lot of different kinds of classes. I do want to start by thanking these fantastic panelists. I've learned so much already from this conversation. So thank you very much. And also to thank Nakiba and Scott and Nadia, as well as Ali, for sort of helping to organize this. So we've heard about a lot of different framings, ways to think about the problems of climate migration and the challenges that we as a planet are going to have in the next few years and are already having. We've talked about the national security framework, the economic framework, looking at it from an environmental or climate context or a wildlife context. So what I'm going to do is talk about it sort of in terms of a dignity framework. And as you'll see, when we talk about dignity, I'll end up mentioning a lot of the issues that have already been talked about in this program. So let me just start by saying why I'm talking about dignity. In part, it's because last August, the American Bar Association, as some of you know, and I hope all of you know, the ABA passed a resolution that recognized that human dignity, which it defined as the inherent and equal and inalienable worth of every person, is foundational to a just rule of law. Just look at that language. It's monumental, really. And then it goes on in the second paragraph to further resolve that the ABA urges governments to ensure that dignity rights be reflected in the exercise of their legislative, executive, and judicial functions. So it's not just a feel-good notion that dignity is so important. It's also, it has a sort of implementation aspect to it that governments in the US and abroad should reflect dignity rights in everything that they do. So the ABA Center for Human Rights has recently established a dignity rights initiative to implement this, and we've been working with with Scott and others, and Nadia and others involved in the dignity rights initiative to implement this. The other sort of angle that I come at this from is a project that I've been working on through the Delaware Law School, as Nakiba mentioned, through the Delaware Law School's Dignity Rights Project with my colleague Jim May, as well as the Environmental Law Institute and the UN International Organization for Migration, where we're developing a framework for migration with dignity. Migration with dignity is a phrase that gets sort of used a lot, but hasn't up until now been defined or elaborated on, to sort of investigate what we actually mean when we want migration to happen with dignity. So we're working on a report right now that's going to define that. And then the project is sort of a multi-year project that's going to test and implement the framework in migration corridors around the world. And we're looking at it through these sort of six categories of rights. First, equality and non-discrimination, questions of freedom of movement, questions of personal safety and security, questions of quality of life and well-being, access to services, and civil and political rights. So those are sort of the at least tentative structures through which we're going to be looking at how we can develop a framework for migration with dignity. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is sort of informed by that work. So when we talk about dignity, the starting point for much of this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, actually the UN Charter from 3 years earlier, and then the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man, which also sort of foregrounded dignity. But it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that really starts to define it and make it meaningful, even though that itself was not a binding document, but the ideas that have their seeds in the UDHR have flourished in law elsewhere, and that's what I'll talk a lot about in this presentation. So the UDHR mentions dignity in a few different ways. Here are a couple of them. First, in the preamble, recognizing that the inherent dignity of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. You'll recall that the ABA resolution says something similar, saying that dignity is the foundation of a just rule of law, but these are sort of complementary concepts. And then in Article 1, the UDHR says that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, and I would amend the UDHR to say sisterhood as well. There are some really important concepts that are sort of snuck into this language. First, the idea of dignity as being universal, that all you have to do is just to be born a member of the human family and you've got dignity. That's enough. It's not a question of merit or accomplishment or rank or conditions of birth or anything else. Everybody has human dignity. And then secondly, in the first sentence of Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The idea is that this is not just a feel-good sentence about how great it is to be human. It's actually a statement, a legal statement about the rights that flow from the recognition of human dignity. And so this connection we start to see in the UDHR that sort of flourishes, and we're seeing it in full bloom now throughout the world, between the fact of dignity, the recognition of human dignity on the one hand, and legal and enforceable rights on the other hand. So I'll talk in the remainder of my comments a little bit about dignity on one side and then rights on the other. The UDHR doesn't really define much of what it means by dignity, by using that term. The one hint that it gives is in the second sentence of Article 1, connecting the notion of dignity with reason and conscience. And a certain kind of morality. And what this suggests is that because human beings distinctively, and we can argue about robots on the one hand, we can argue about other sentient beings on the other hand, and I don't think the UDHR necessarily excludes any of those, but it does say, at least for the species of humans as a species have reason and conscience, and that imposes on us a certain morality, a certain obligation to act a certain way towards one another, but it also gives us a right to agency, to our own identity, to plan our own lives. And I think that has really significant consequences in the context of migration, as we'll see. So dignity, as I mentioned, is not excessively defined in the UDHR, but what we see is from the international law and from national law, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about what that is. But what we see, just to start with a sort of a working definition, and this is echoed in the ABA resolution, is that dignity partakes of 5 qualities. First of all, it's universal. And again, that's important. It just means that everybody has it, right? Everybody around the world has it. Secondly, it's inherent, which means we're born with it. And it's inalienable, which means we can't lose it. Everybody has dignity in equal measure. All are born in equal dignity and rights. So everybody has the same quantum of dignity. There's no gradations of value of humanity. Once we are born human, we have dignity. And finally, the idea of worth, the idea that every life matters. And all of these have particular significance to the concept of migration with dignity and to the application of the lives of people who migrate. The fact that it's universal means that it's not defined by sovereign jurisdiction. It's not defined by sovereign territory. Sovereignties can define citizenship, but they don't get to define dignity. The fact that it's inherent, again, means that you're not waiting for a country or a state or a government to grant you dignity. It's not a right in the sense that it's dependent on states to grant. It's inherent, meaning that you have a claim to it against the states. It becomes a measure of the justness of state action, not something that's within sort of the legislative or the legislative discretion of a state, if you will. It's inalienable, meaning it cannot be taken away. Governments cannot act towards people in a way that takes away their dignity, can take away their citizenship. It can define people's legal status, but it cannot define their worth. Again, equality has specific relevance in the context of migration. First of all, it means that as a matter of human worth, there is no distinction between citizens and non-citizens. There's no distinction between those who are here and those who are coming later. There's no distinction between where people come from, some from countries that we prefer to get migrants from, and some countries some migrants coming from places that we prefer not to have migrants come from. That's not something that is consonant with equal dignity, nor in terms of skills, nor in terms of medical conditions, nor in terms of anything else. And finally, again, the idea of worth, the idea that nobody's life is dispensable. Every life has value. So the suggestion has been made, and I'll credit Scott for coming up with the phrase, that it's as if people should have a dignity passport that has universal jurisdiction. He said the phrase, and I told him I was going to steal it, but I am giving him credit for it. But it's a brilliant idea, right? Because it suggests that migrants, wherever they go, have this conceptual dignity passport, right? It doesn't have to be a piece of paper that they have to bring with them, and if they forget it, they don't have the rights. It's just with their dignity, they get this right to enter any country and to be treated like a person when they get there. And it should apply universally. So the idea of dignity in the context of migration allows us to do a number of things. It allows us to focus on people. It allows us to use, as we were talking about a moment ago, an environmental justice filter. Well, this encourages us to use a human dignity filter, to ask whether the policies that we're advancing or advocating, the laws that we're using in court, whether they actually protect and promote the human dignity of everybody. It also forces us to think, and this is a huge challenge because the numbers of people that we're talking about is so extraordinary, but it requires us to remember that each one of those millions, hundreds of millions of people are individuals, and each one of those people has individual human worth and has some right to agency over their own lives. So again, that's sort of what we get from the idea of dignity. What the UDHR suggests, though, is that it doesn't stop there, that concept of dignity, the recognition of dignity, implies certain rights that have to be recognized. So we see dignity rights at all levels. We see it in international law, in the 2 international covenants. We see it in a number of other human rights instruments, the Global Compact for Migration, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Convention on the Rights of the Child. We see it in regional human rights law, and we see it in domestic law, in constitutions and laws, regulation, and now in the United States in the ABA resolution. So what are we seeing? What are these rights that are accorded? Well, first, just to give you a sort of a brief overview of what dignity looks like in constitutions. There are about 194 countries that are member states of the UN, and about 160 of them recognize dignity in their constitution. Many of them recognize it more than once, meaning they keep coming back to this theme in different contexts. So we see dignity sometimes as a foundational value. It's the value upon which the state is based. We see it sometimes explicitly as an actionable right. You can go into court and claim that your right to dignity has been violated. In constitutions where it's not explicit or actionable, we've seen it implied, especially from the right to life, but also in other areas, from the right to privacy and family. We've seen it implicit in equal protection, in some places explicit in context of equal protection. In the US, in Obergefell, we saw it sort of at the confluence of equal protection and due process. We also see it in the 8th Amendment, in US constitutionalism and elsewhere. We see it in other constitutions as the very purpose of protecting human rights. And in countries like Peru and the Dominican Republic, as the very purpose of the state itself, and this is sort of a crucial idea when we're thinking about sovereignty, that you can actually take sovereignty as it is and reorient it towards dignity and say, if states are going to have this sovereign control, the sovereign power, they need to use it for the protection of dignity. And then we see it in many constitutions in relation to certain segments of the population, and also in relation to certain particular kinds of interests like education, medicine, health, work, etc. So that's an overview of the way we see the language of dignity recognized in the constitutions. Because it's in so many constitutions, we see it in thousands of judicial opinions across the world relating to pretty much every conceivable right that you can, that is protected. Civil and rights such as voting, speech, assembly, access to justice. Regina mentioned the right of public participation. We see it in connection with that, a dignity-based right to public participation. We see it with respect to social and economic rights, housing, health, education, those kinds of things. And increasingly, we're seeing it in the context of environmental and climate justice. So we're seeing courts really embrace this notion of dignity and apply it to the rights of people in all of these different contexts. The Constitutional Court, so this is a huge amount of information. I include this slide just to sort of give you a way to characterize this or categorize this. The Constitutional Court of Columbia has helpfully recognized that we can think of dignity in three different categories. One is autonomy, or the possibility of living, of designing a life plan, living as one wishes. This is the notion of agency and identity and sort of being able to create your life, which migrants are trying to do. The second is dignity in terms of certain material conditions, like the idea of living with dignity, how people live, do they have what they need to live with dignity? And thirdly, in terms of living without humiliation. And to that, I would add a fourth category of participation and access to justice. And we see cases in all those different categories. Ama mentioned before the Taisiota case. And I'll just mention one thing about it that she didn't, just to complement what she was talking about. And she gave a really good overview of the nature of the case and how that case opens up the possibility to create, to sort of make claims about climate migration. Technically, what the Human Rights Committee was asked to do was decide whether the situation in Kiribati violated the right to life. And what the committee said was that the right to life has to be understood as the right of all individuals to enjoy a life with dignity. That when we say there's a right to life, what we really mean is not just mere existence. What we mean is the right to enjoy a life with dignity. And the committee further recognized that environmental degradation and climate change constitute extremely serious threats to the ability of both present and future generations to enjoy a right to live with dignity. And then, as she mentioned, imposed on states this obligation to protect that right to life. So this is a sort of a backdoor way, because as she mentioned, climate refugee status doesn't exist under the international law of asylum. But what you can do is recognize that whether or not you're classified as a refugee for international law purposes, your life, your right to live with dignity, is being threatened by these conditions. The majority of the committee said that the facts didn't support the claim that in those circumstances of that case, that his right to live with dignity was threatened. The dissenting views said no, it was. The point of that is just simply that opens the door to make the even stronger case that conditions relating to climate change will very much threaten the right to live with dignity. So I just want to sort of ask you to engage in this question, in this sort of flight of imagination, if you will, about what our policy towards immigration would look like if migrants all had a dignity passport with universal jurisdiction. And I'll leave you just with this, and to thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this. I think this is a fantastic conversation. I look forward to continuing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. And in following up with your presentation, one thing that stood out to me is something that I also brought up with Ama. It's the reconciliation of sovereignty and facilitating a dignity passport. So you, like verbatim what you said is that sovereignty can define citizenship, but not dignity. And so you're basically saying, as such, dignity in and of itself should provide standing for a migrant, perhaps, who is having to move transnationally.
Yeah, more than standing, but the right to be respected as a person. Absolutely.
Right.
So that you, right. And I mean, my feeling is just about sovereignty generally. I feel like as much as I can imagine better, different, more fair and just worlds, it is hard to imagine a world without state sovereignty. I think that's the reality that we're dealing with right now. So my sort of way of thinking about it is to accept the fact of state sovereignty, but it doesn't have to be an impediment to human rights. I think for so long we've thought of state sovereignty as, states being able to say, because I'm sovereign, we have the rights to do all these things. Under a dignity framework, that's simply not true. That eliminates many things, that it prohibits the states from engaging in many things if they're going to respect sovereignty, the dignity of every human being, every person who's a member of the human family, whether they're citizens or not.
Thank you so much. And so, Erin, you have allowed us to really look at climate change through the scope of human rights, I think is what I mostly got from your presentation, and how we can apply human rights or expand on the framework or the lens through which we look at human rights to now include people who are affected by climate change. So thank you all three speakers. And now I'm going to invite everybody to jump in as I have general questions for everyone. The first of which is actually from the Q&A section, where a person asked, how do you balance focus on climate adaptation efforts versus climate migration efforts? So this is open to all panelists.
I can start off. So I think that's a really excellent question, and I'll take this opportunity to highlight that most people who are leaving home would actually prefer to stay home. Most migrants would prefer to stay in place, but there are cases where people will have to move, where it's not possible to move back, or where migration will actually be beneficial and that people might want to move. But I think in terms of balancing between adaptation and migration, I think both are necessary. Adaptation helps people stay in place. If we have, just to give a simple example, if you've built a seawall, and so houses in a certain community are protected and not destroyed during a high tide or a storm surge, that allows people to stay in place. But adaptation measures are really expensive, and there are certain climate impacts to which there's just no adapting that we can see as being possible given our technical capacity right now. So this is just to say that adaptation is preferable, but there will be people who will have to move, especially as climate impacts worsen. And so it's important to be doing both.
Any other feedback from any of the other panelists? Thank you so much, Amma. And my second question is also from the Q&A, and we do encourage everyone who has questions to jump in the Q&A at this time for it to be answered. So the second question I pulled was, can you elaborate, and this is also again going to be for Amma, but I would love for Erin and Regina to jump in as well. Please elaborate on the idea that climate migration is a national security concern.
I'll go ahead, Erin. I'll jump in afterwards.
No, I mean, I was really just going to sort of echo that we shouldn't view it that way. Sort of what you had said before. I think that that undermines what we're trying to do in so many different ways, and it gives the state probably much more authority to do things that we would prefer them not to do. And there's no evidence that it is a national security issue.
So would you say, Erin, that it's somewhat being politicized? Because that's the general idea I've gotten from this question. And I guess we can actually, be a bit, not controversial, but a bit provocative in actually highlighting how that may have been a politicized statement, perhaps, in saying that it could be a national security threat.
I mean, I'll just jump in and just sort of say that when we view human beings as national security threats, we're challenging a dignity paradigm, right? Because in my view, of course, I think we should view them as human beings who are worthy of being treated as people, not as threats. And I think someone had said it earlier, I think it was Amma, but that the problem is not the migrants. The problem is our laws and how we need to deal with this reality of the planet that we're seeing already, you know, so many migrants, and we're going to be seeing an increase of that. So I think to view it as a national security or even as an economic issue does a disservice to how we should be thinking about the people whose lives matter.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I guess to explain what the argument is, though I don't give it credence, is that that if migrants come in large numbers, then they will overwhelm the capacity of receiving communities, and this will cause tension. That tension will lead to conflict, political conflict, community conflict. So that's the general idea, but I will point out that the securitization, talking about migration in terms of national security, is actually relatively new. It's simply a framing. If we talk about colonization, for example, that's a mass movement of people that's not framed as a national security threat. And people have been moving from very early on, but choosing to talk about national security as a way it's a choice in terms of framing migration. And I think it's the incorrect choice, not because it ignores people's dignity, as Erin is just saying, but also because it doesn't accurately capture the ways in which migration actually benefits receiving communities. If something is a threat, then there's no opportunity to see migration as something that is good or worthwhile or helpful. And I think that's simply just not true.
And I would like to add to that. So a specific example I can think of is actually Rwanda, who spoke at the 2019 International Migration and Development High-Level Dialogue at the UN. Rwanda was a very specific case study where it was absolutely in favor of allowing migration. There was a reported 80% of migration that was taking place intracontinentally in Africa. And Rwanda explained that it has been completely open to migration, and it's actually seen this economic surge. It's actually seen economic surge not only in Rwanda, but for people back in home countries. That there is going to now be more of an increase in encouraging of the migration because of these positive effects, and eventually and ultimately what has happened is that Africa has agreed to providing more protocol for what you mentioned, Amma, is more organized and planned out migration. So as I mentioned, the UN, this is also a question for everyone on the table. I want to talk a little bit about the SDGs, and I individually would like each of you to provide some insight on how you think climate migration and displacement could be integrated into the SDGs. So for context, I'm actually going to explain what SDGs are for those who are not necessarily aware of that term. So SDGs are Sustainable Development Goals, and they're actually a collection of 17 global goals designed to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. It was actually set in 2015 by the United Nations General Assembly, and it has a goal of 2030 under a UN resolution. So I'd like each panelist to see where you think that this fits, because it's not a question of if this is actually intertwined with the Sustainable Development Goals. Climate migration is, climate change absolutely is. So I'd love to hear, starting with Regina, how you think that this discussion can fit into the SDGs.
Well, I think from my perspective and what I presented today, the SDGs actually, for me, are a little bit troublesome because these projects are done in the name of meeting SDGs, right? Clean energy, helping to alleviate poverty, and we're not seeing any of the impacts of that. So I think where I'm at with them is that I think that you can address climate migration and climate displacement in a lot of these in terms of equality, and there's I think there's a couple that are related to gender in making sure you have that. But then what the issue becomes is what happens when the government has a focus on how they want to use the SDGs, and really it ends up causing more human rights problems. So I'm not really a fan of just pushing everything into the SDG categories, because I think sometimes they can be abused. And I think we're starting to see that. And that's the same kind of problem I have with us saying we have solutions to climate change and we're not thinking smartly about them. So, but I do think that if they can be balanced better within a human rights context, then maybe it'll make sense. But I think one of them, for instance, like access to justice, I think with these green projects, I think we're seeing a lack of that. And I think that that's one place where if they want to continue with these projects, then let's also increase the other sustainable development goals that need to come around and complement that.
Erin?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to split my time into two, because I just want to say something really quickly also about the previous conversation about sort of recognizing the benefits of migration. And while I agree with that, I also think that we should be careful about using a cost-benefit analysis for migration. First of all, because they are human beings and should be valued whether or not they provide some sort of benefit to a community. And because, I mean, people migrate for all kinds of reasons, but when we're talking about climate migrants, we're talking about people who are not choosing to leave. They don't want to leave, as the poem on the screen suggests. And what we're looking at is just a massive global displacement of people. And we, as those on the receiving side of migration communities and in countries that have sort of the choices of how to make laws, we should just be recognizing that people are here, and it's not a question of whether, it's a question of how do we integrate people into our communities when they're moving around the world to get there. And I think that sort of fits in a little bit to what I wanted to say about the SDGs, which I'll just mention real briefly. But Jermaine, I just finished a chapter and some other writing about the dignity thread that runs through the SDGs. And again, I have complete sympathy with what Regina was saying, and sort of the caution and maybe even the skepticism a little bit with which we should be viewing these things before we sort of jump in and say, oh, this must be good. But I also think a little bit like what I was saying about sovereignty, if we view the SDGs as being fundamentally about advancing human dignity, which is really, I believe, what they are about, then I think we go in and we say, absolutely, the SDGs are a perfectly good tool for doing that. We have to just maintain a vigilance over what our goals are. So I'll just stop with that. Thank you.
Yeah, to be responsive, Erin, thank you for that provocation and that pushback. I think that's really important, and I think that's really right. And I saw a question in the chat that asked whether the media focuses too much on movement from the global south to the global north, and I think this is related to what Erin was saying. That it's important to also highlight that the majority of climate migrants are moving within the global south. So even though the news and even me sometimes highlights movement to the US or to Europe, that's actually not where most climate migrants will end up. And so I just want to point that out because I don't think we've highlighted that in conversation before. And not only is this dignity framework important, this idea of human beings carrying around this right to dignity since birth. But also, if you look at the reason why people are moving, it's because of the effects of industrialization in countries. So not only do people have this dignity, but countries that have emitted carbon pollution such that other people have to move really have an obligation to receive those people. And some would even argue that have a legal obligation under the UN climate change framework. So I just want to highlight that as well. And in terms of the SDGs, I just want to underscore gender. You mentioned this, Naikiba, in your introduction, but I think sometimes in these conversations, we forget to talk about the way that women and non-binary people are especially at risk when migrating, making these journeys because of sexualized violence and because of the incredible perils that migrants can face in making these life-threatening journeys. So I just want to lift that up as well, and say that in terms of gender equity, that's a really important lens to this discussion as well.
Thank you so much, Fatma, for highlighting that. It's really important. And I'm really, again, also appreciative of the pushback that you all three. SDGs absolutely have their critiques, and they're extremely valid critiques. And I think that, Erin, you made a really good point about having the unifying thread in all the SDGs be dignity. I think it would absolutely change the framework. But you are right, Regina. It's more from the perspective of, well, how do we get this thing done quickly? How do we stop carbon emissions? And it's, again, without the foresight of what's going to happen down the line. And are these sustainable development goals actually sustainable? Or are they only sustainable to certain people groups? And it, again, comes back to the topic of equity. So I wanted to, you mentioned an obligation, Amma, just now. You mentioned that there should be an obligation, which I agree with, and I think most people, if you look at a graph of carbon emissions, it's mostly coming, of course, from the global. It's coming mostly from like 2 or 3 countries, honestly, and so it's having this adverse effect on the global South. And so there is a thought process that it's an intrinsic right of the global South to somewhat get some restitution. Do you guys want to talk a little bit in the time that we have left? Just talk a little bit about what that restitution could look like, or how it can be responsibly enforced. Do you think it's an enforceable thing? The floor is open for anyone.
Well, I'll just jump in. I think as far as the restitution, I won't touch specifically what you just asked with that, but I will say in terms of the projects that I've talked about, I think the people who are owed compensation in that respect should be able to get what the governments have told them that they're owed. And I think in those specific situations, governments should be obligated to uphold their end of the bargain when they say they're going to compensate and relocate people. I think the bigger problem that while I think a lot of the things that we're saying are good, the problem that I see is how do we get everybody to really agree on enforcing these norms? I mean, we have that problem just generally with some of the human rights norms we have, right? So like economic, cultural, and social rights sometimes are pushed to the side, and they're not really, we don't really emphasize, we don't really go after people who violate those norms. And then that leads to a very slippery slope. And we see that with groups like the Uyghurs and the Rohingya and things that get taken from them. And all over the place this happens. So I think my bigger issue would be like when we talk about restitution and things like that, in the examples I used, it really comes down to a population that's within the territory of a government, that the government and those people go back and forth. But in situations like this, when we're talking about migration and people moving around, I think the real question we have to think about is what that is in terms of enforcement. So I'm not really sure that I have the answer for that, but I would be curious what Erin and Amma think about it.
Erin's on mute, so I'll jump in here. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there are things that can be done. So there could be a special visa category for climate migrants, for example. If you talk to people who spend a lot of time thinking about this, that brings up the issue of causality. It's really hard to trace a particular instance of migration to a specific climate-related event. But there are ways to get around that. You can establish quotas, for example, for countries that are severely impacted by climate change. There are some countries that have designed visa schemes or work programs to target people from climate impacted countries. And so there are ways to enforce it. It's often a matter of will. So Regina is really asking me to think about how we make governments accountable to people. I think that's sort of a bigger question here, because we have solutions, but how do we get these governments to actually implement them? And I think that comes from organizing in political power and really lifting our voices as communities.
And the thing that I firstly thought about was when you mentioned the FCCC, the Paris Agreement, and I thought, well, it's not enforceable. So, and I think that's the biggest issue in international law today. There's so many amazing ideas and frameworks and conventions and treaties, but are they binding? And I think that's a great place to end it, and for everyone to really and truly think about, you know, how if these frameworks aren't really protecting us, then how can we in our individual actions actually think about the ramifications that or seemingly green ideas and green projects have on indigenous peoples and vulnerable people groups who may have to move and they don't actually want to move. So with that, thank you so much everyone for joining this webinar. I absolutely would like to also express my gratitude to this esteemed group of panelists this afternoon. You all are doing such critical work, and we can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your schedule to share your knowledge, your research and your experience. This section of the civil rights and social justice of the ABA provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope that this was helpful in your work. And again, if you can, please consider joining and becoming an active member of the ABA. You may do so at ambar.org/CRSJ. You can find information on other free programs from the CRSJ webpage. And we're just wishing everyone best of luck in your work and everyone to stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Nakiba.